Hi, welcome back to Common Sense Care, Parenting Your Gender Confused Child with Truth and Love, brought to you by Partners for Ethical Care. So-called affirmative care is the gender industry's one-size-fits-all treatment plan for all people who suffer with issues with their identity. In no other area of education, psychology, or medicine is one treatment plan assigned to every person. At Partners for Ethical Care, we believe that each child is an individual and should be treated as an individual and given the care that's most appropriate for him or her. So welcome back. I'm Maria Keffler.
I'm Erin Brewer, and boy, today's topic is a heavy one. And in the introduction, you talked about how important it is for children to get the care that they need and deserve. And boy, is that really applicable to today's topic.
Yeah, today we're talking about trauma and gender dysphoria. And I know we talked a little bit before we started taping about some of your experiences and why you're in this struggle and why you're fighting to protect children. So I'd really just love to start with hearing what you have to say about trauma.
Yeah, and being in this as I've started to network with other people, get to know those who have desisted and detransitioned, I am realizing how common my experience was, and how it can really trigger this gender dysphoria and people feeling like they're born in the wrong body. And I had no idea until recently, that this was a very common response to sexual assault. And so, some people who have watched my other videos know that I have a history of sexual assault. When I was young, I was very little, and it's hard for me to talk about it without getting emotional, so I might get a little emotional. When it was just a little kid between kindergarten and first grade, I was sexually assaulted. And one of the responses of that kind of trauma, where a child is incredibly helpless and being violated and hurt, both physically and emotionally, is a dissociative response. And this is, in a way, it's a gift because it allows us to kind of leave ourselves so that we don't have to experience the full horror of what is happening to us.
Can
And
you
so,
talk just a little bit about what is dissociation?
sure.
What happens when you're dissociating?
Right. Yeah, it's actually an amazing coping mechanism. But what basically happens is that you feel completely disembodied. So part of the trauma that I experienced, part of the assault I experienced, I remember very well physically. I remember the feelings very well physically. I remember the feeling of being restrained, and trying to get away. But at some point, when the pain and confusion became too much, it was like I just left my body and I was no longer Erin. I was just sort of out there, and it was happening to somebody else. If it really, it felt like it was happening to somebody else. Once that happens, one time, it's easier to do it the next time you experience a struggle. It's the neural pathways actually develop to allow that dissociative response, because I think that, for whatever reason, we've evolved so that if we're in traumatic situations, we develop coping mechanisms. And so if you think about that response, and then specifically in the case of sexual assault, where a girl's body is being violated, um, it's not surprising that a very common response is gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia. So that feeling of just intense hatred towards your body, because in my case, I felt like it was my body's fault that I got hurt. If I had been a boy, it wouldn't have happened. And I just had this incredible self-hatred. And so it wasn't a conscious thing. When I decided I was a boy, it wasn't like I kind of worked all this out. It was, I was a little kid. And I'm sure it was just this kind of response of, I'm not that kid anymore. That didn't happen to me. That happened to somebody else. I'm not Erin anymore. I'm Timothy. And if I could convince other people of that, then I felt safer. And that's really what I wanted, is for them to say, oh, you're right. You're not Erin. You're not that little girl who got hurt. Thankfully, my school psychologist didn't affirm me. And I'm so grateful, because a lot of times children do things as coping mechanisms that work in the short term, but they're not good long-term responses. And so that would not have served me well throughout my life, to be told that I was born in the wrong body, because it would have reinforced those feelings of self-hatred that I had, that sense that my body had betrayed me, that there was something wrong with me, my body. And again, it would have encouraged me to harm myself even more. So rather than to work through what had happened, it would have encouraged me to run away and to essentially become a new person, so I didn't have to deal with the trauma. But one of the things that we know about trauma is that it's really important for kids to be able to process it appropriately. So I actually got involved in this issue when they started introducing therapy bans, and when I realized these bans were attempting to ban the very therapy that helped me when I was a child and would help others who endured these kinds of things. Essentially saying, you don't get to have appropriate treatment for the trauma that you endured, and instead we're going to encourage you down this harmful pathway. And to me, that's just heartbreaking. It's like, not only did the child endure the trauma, but then we're going to deny them from the appropriate care. And then we're going to reinforce their feelings of self-hatred. And I can't think of anything like more disservice to these kids who need support and love and appropriate care. That's really what they need. So I tell my story, and others tell their story. And we actually have a video, if we could watch it, where some other young women talk about having endured trauma, and the result was this development of a transgender identity. So it's not just me. It's actually looking like a pretty common response to early childhood trauma for girls.
There are children who dissociate from their biological sex because they have survived sexual abuse, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, that also causes them to internalize, I'm not safe or lovable in my biological sex.
I think my transition was a result of childhood trauma. It was a plethora of experiences that told my subconscious that I wasn't right being female. So I altered my body to extreme lengths. I went through more than one body should ever be able to handle.
My home life was dysfunctional. My dad was verbally and emotionally abusive towards my mom, which gave me the impression that women were hated, weak, and vulnerable. At the age of 19, I began to take male hormones, changed my name, and I began to live as a man.
I thought that it was the answer for all of my problems. And of course, this is all happening subconsciously. There's a whole bunch of things in my subconscious that told me who I was not okay. It told me who I was wrong.
I had just gone through a very traumatic sexual experience with an older man. I wanted to change my gender after that happened. Then I went to a therapist from the LGBT center who told me that she was ready to get me on hormones from day one, like excited and ready to just help me transition.
I have a history of childhood trauma that contributed and still contributes to feelings of dysphoria and dissociation and total just disconnect in my body.
So Maria, in that clip, the young women talked about trauma, and I talked about my sexual trauma, but it's important for us to also talk about the fact that there are lots of different kinds of trauma that can cause, first of all, a dissociative response. Anytime somebody, especially a child, becomes really scared, they can develop that dissociative pattern. And that dissociation, what it does is it kind of makes you feel separate from your body, almost like it's me and my body, and we're not necessarily on the same team. We're not necessarily the same person.
Well, that's exactly what the gender industry is telling people, right? Is that, oh, you can have one brain or one mind or one soul of a certain sex and then a body of a different sex.
Right.
And we just know there's no scientific evidence to support that. But as you're talking about dissociation, to me, that just sounds like exactly what the gender industry is creating and promoting. And that's not a healthy coping mechanism.
No, it wasn't like I mean, I've been to a number of different therapists and none of them said, "Oh, that's wonderful. You're dissociating. Let's encourage that. How can we make you feel even more separate from your body?" That was not the approach that any of them took. Their goal was to help me not do that, because dissociation not only does it make you vulnerable to the gender industry, but it makes you vulnerable in general. When someone's dissociating, they're not making good choices. It's like they're not really connected to the world. And it's really hard to describe, but it's almost like a dream state, or you know, you hear stories about when people die, and they sometimes will talk about leaving their body, and that's almost how it feels like,
I wonder if it's similar to like a drug trip, like when
right.
you're
And it probably is. There are certain drugs where you'd get that. And so if you have somebody who's dissociating and you're encouraging that, you're actually making them more vulnerable to predators. Because if somebody's in a dissociative state, they're more likely to go into a freeze state if they're confronted with a situation where they're about to be violated. And so it not only encourages the gender confusion, but it also makes them more vulnerable. And so we're taking children who have already suffered and basically encouraging them to be more vulnerable, to hate themselves more, and to self-harm. And that's another aspect of trauma that I experienced, and many other trauma victims experience, is that sense of wanting to harm yourself. So girls often will cut. I would take big rocks and just pound them against myself. Sometimes I would pound them against my private parts to the point where, it would be bloody. There were often times where I had scabs on my head because I'd be brushing my hair and I'd just be filled with a rage and just start, just whacking it. So that self-harming tendency, again, it's because you blame your body. It's a sense of like, my body's the one that got me in this situation. If I'd had a different body, it wouldn't have happened. And that self-harming is really common. And so a lot of the things that the gender industry wants children to do are actually promoting self-harm. So it's like it's taking this pathology and making making it much worse than rather than healing.
Well, I talked to one counselor about self-harm, and he told me that there's this balance between hope and pain.
Mhm.
And he described it kind of like a seesaw. And the less hope you have, the more pain you have. And there's a point at which the hope is so low that people start inflicting pain on themselves just to release it. He said, like, the pain is trapped inside, and to get it out, they, cut or hit or, do something to like open up their bodies so that they can feel the pain to get it out. And I can't say I've really experienced that, so I don't know if I'm describing it well or not.
Yeah, the other thing that I think that there's that sense of like wanting to externalize the mental pain. So when you're feeling that sort of intense mental pain, it's hard to like even put it into words, and it's so much easier just to like make it physical. And the other thing for me that would happen is that there were times where it would almost be like, I can dissociate. And then there were other times where it was like I was flipped right back into where I was when I was that little girl, and like felt almost like I was stuck there again. And so sometimes it would just be a sense of like,
In the trauma,
in the
like you
trauma, it
back
was like I
into
was reliving it. And so sometimes that, that pounding would be to like pull me out of my brain, pull me out of that memory. Because it was, I don't want to live this again. I'm just going to like beat myself. And then I'm focused on the pain in my body rather than the pain in my head. So I think, again, it's this sense of wanting to escape. And these therapy bans actually prevent therapists from sort of eking out the potential causes of these gender identity issues. And that's what's so heartbreaking, is that these kids have gone through trauma. They've developed really coping skills that are helping them in the present, but that are going to be really harmful in the long term. And then they're not even able to get appropriate mental health care. I mean,
once a child says the magic words gender,
yep.
gender identity, transgender or something, then all these bans fall into place. Almost like I was watching a sci-fi show, and it was Tony Stark, and he said, engage barn door protocol, and all the doors come slamming down, and you're isolated inside, and there's no help. And we had touched on a little bit ago that there's lots of different kinds of trauma that kids go through, not just sexual trauma. And I don't mean just as though it's a small thing.
No, but there's lots of other categories of trauma that can cause very similar responses.
Yeah, divorce is a huge one. And I think we've become so desensitized to divorce in our society, we've become so used to it, that we don't appreciate that divorce is death in a child's life. It is the death of their family. I had one friend who, she's now a therapist, but she told me when she was little, her parents divorced. She had 3 siblings. One parent took 2 siblings, the other parent took 2 siblings. She said, I lost 2/3 of my siblings, one of my parents. Everybody moved. So I lost my house, I lost my school, I lost my friends. Overnight, practically. This is hugely traumatic for a child.
And again, the control
And there's
issue, the child had no control over it. And when children feel completely helpless and out of control, that can induce a trauma response.
There's, death in the family, death of a friend, death of a pet can be very, very traumatic for a child. There's just all sorts of things, all kinds of abuse, rejection. And we often think of trauma as huge things like a sexual assault that like you experienced, or a family divorce. But even things that seem fairly small, especially to an adult, can seem really huge to a child. And the effect is still a powerful one on that child.
Yeah, I actually talked to a detransitioner who came from a Japanese family, and she was the 3rd child born. And in the Japanese culture, this was a while ago, it was really important to have a son. And she was their 3rd and last child, and she was born a girl. And even though nobody explicitly said she should have been a boy, she felt this pressure that there was something wrong with her because she had let down the family. And that's not exactly trauma, but it's again that sense of powerlessness, and the sense of like letting people down and not being the right person, not being the person you're supposed to be. So there are lots of big traumas that people recognize, and there are also these little traumas in people's lives. And again, I don't mean little as in to minimize, because to a child, something that can be seen as as adults we might think is fairly minimal could be really quite profound to a child.
And it could also be just less visible. It's something, a sexual trauma that's very overt. The child might be hiding it from the parents, but it is a single event or a series of events that happened. Whereas some of the things, like what that young Japanese girl felt, was sort of internalized rejection, or and I know you can see things that aren't necessarily there. And so if she was feeling that and thinking, I should have been a boy, if her mother maybe really made a big deal over their neighbor's baby boy, like, oh, he's so cute, oh, you're so lucky to have a son, she would hear that as rejection. Oh, I'm not as cute, I didn't give my family a son.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important. And that was something that I learned from a detransitioner, that sense of like, a lot of detransitioners or desisters talk about, sexual assault, but that there are all kinds of other traumas that can cause this sense of being in the wrong body, of not being okay who you are. And of course, we know that again, if a child comes up to somebody and says, boy, I'm really stupid, we don't go around affirming that. We don't say, oh, you're right, you are stupid. There's really nothing you can do. You're just going to have to accept that you're stupid. Um, we don't do that. We don't do that when kids are depressed and say, oh, you're right, your life is really meaningless. There's really no point to go on living. We don't affirm these negative feelings. And yet in this one situation we do. And it's the same thing as affirming a child and saying they're stupid or that their depression is appropriate. It's
Or
very
affirming a child who's cutting. If you
right.
see a child that's got cuts all
Right.
on your arm, you don't say, let me get you some extra knives in case
Exactly.
it's dull.
Right.
We don't do that.
Right. And yet we have surgeons who are willing to cut off a child's breasts, which is that's self-harming behavior. It's the same as cutting. And so you're right. We don't go and get them razor blades. We get them help. In this one situation, and I do believe it's because there's money behind it, that the gender industry is making so much money. I saw a graph a couple days ago of a surgeon who does mastectomies on women, and it showed like one or two, um, 10 or 15 years ago, and then it just climbed to the
I
point
saw
where
that a couple hundred.
yeah, where their practice can't even handle them all. They're having to bring in new surgeons because there are all these women who are wanting to cut their breasts off. And now we're having, young women and children cutting their breasts off. And that is self-harming behavior. As you said, if somebody came in and said, I don't like my arm, it's I'm somehow it's not my arm. I'm born in the wrong arm, cut it off. Surgeons aren't going to do that. And yet we feel like these body parts that are associated with sex characteristics are expendable. So we can cut off breasts and we can cut off penises and testicles. This is
But
self-harming behavior.
we look at Vincent Van Gogh, the famous artist, and there's the story of him cutting off his ear and sending it to this woman who rebuffed him. We don't look at that and go, wow, what a great thing that he did. It's sort of a joke. If you
Yeah.
pull Van Gogh, you self-harm.
Right.
And,
It's
and
that
we
it's that
recognize
angsty artisty thing. And yet I know of a man who went through and had his penis and testicles cut off after a sexual assault because he focused all that anger and blame on his genitals. In what world do we feel like we want to encourage this behavior? I mean, it's just heartbreaking. And I think so many parents don't understand the connection, which is one of the reasons we wanted to touch on this topic. And you actually have some good information about the different types of trauma responses, so that if parents have a child, they can maybe pick up if there's been a trauma. Because in my case, I actually went right home, and my brother was with me, and we told my parents what had happened. Unfortunately, because they were involved in a drug culture, they didn't want to call the police because it would have put them at risk. But there are kids who will hide this, especially I think a little bit older kids, because it might be a relative or a family friend who's done it, or it might be that they feel so much shame, or it might be that they've been threatened and told that they will be killed if they tell anybody. So it's important for parents to sort of know, I mean, as horrible as this is, to know this could have happened to your child, and to sort of be aware of some of the signs that this has happened.
Well, one big sign for any kind of psychological issue is some sort of a change, a sudden change in the child's behavior. And it can be a change in eating patterns, inability to sleep, or sleeping too much. A child who was formerly extroverted suddenly becoming introverted, or vice versa. Um, there's not, I wouldn't say one thing like, oh, if you see this, this is a problem. But your child. And when your child suddenly makes some sort of a U-turn or change in their behavior or their attitudes or their their speech patterns. That's just something to look at and go, hey, what's going on?
Yeah. It doesn't
but they're-
necessarily mean they've been traumatized, but it's something to look at. And certainly if your child who's been, you know, a fairly content girl comes home and suddenly insists she's a boy, that's a huge sign that there's something's gone on, that something's going on with that child that really needs to be looked into and not affirmed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are 4 basic responses to trauma, as I understand it from some of the literature I've looked at. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I'm not sure I like that last word, fawn. I think they were just looking for another F word. But the 4 F's of trauma response
Yeah,
are
the other
fight.
3 are fairly self-explanatory. What does fawn mean in this context?
Well, let me start with the first one, and I'll just kind of go through all of them real quickly. Each one of those has a positive response to it or a negative response to it. It can go one of 2 ways. It's kind of like any struggle you go through, you can come out stronger, you can come out weaker, depending how you respond to it. So the fight response, that's just what you might think of. It's kind of coming out swinging. Positives to that can be setting boundaries, being assertive about what's okay and what's not okay. If somebody gets in your face or threatens you, say you're in a bathroom and a guy comes in and starts coming over to you, an assertive fight response might be, I am uncomfortable and I want you to step back. That would be an assertive, good, positive fight response. Negative fight responses, more kind of in the long term, not in those one moment situations, but sort of as a response to trauma, might be becoming very controlling, narcissistic, entitled, becoming a bully. So it's sort of taking the fight response too far and applying it too widely. The second response is flight, and that's, you know, the running away, getting away from the response. Good part of that, or a good response that's a flight response, would be leaving an unhealthy relationship, assessing a situation and seeing, this is a situation I don't want to be in and I'm going to leave this situation. Unhealthy responses with fight are, you know, obsessive compulsive disorder, becoming very afraid, panic attacks, becoming a workaholic, doing something to put your mind elsewhere and kind of ignore or escape the situation. The third one is freeze. Good positive things about freezing can be being very mindful, working, you know, doing meditation, being very aware, just kind of still in the situation and kind of recognizing what's going on. Bad responses to that are, again, dissociation. That's the big one with the freeze response, is dissociation that you talked about, zoning out, brain fog, being kind of having a hard time making decisions, sort of having that paralysis. But then the last one that they call fawn, the positive side of fawning, they would consider having like a real compassionate response, being able to understand and empathize with other people, listening well. Those would be fawning responses that are positive. But negative fawning responses would be becoming codependent, being unable to make decisions for yourself, being a people pleaser, kind of losing your sense of self. So those are sort of the 4 that I've encountered as I've been researching responses to trauma.
And that's so interesting. I think it's important to note that you can have more than one of those, because one of the reasons that my first grade teacher called in the school psychologist to assess me is because I was becoming really aggressive, both towards other kids and towards adults, in a way that was really causing problems in the classroom. And so that was one of the responses, is just this anger and rage and bullying and being mean and rude and disrespectful. But at the same time, when I was faced with a situation where I was scared, I froze and dissociated. And so it's possible to have more than one of those responses. And again, healthy, unhealthy, depending on which way they go. And that's where good therapy could really help. If you can get good intervention early on and help them mold those responses into positive responses, then this trauma isn't going to really impact the person's life in a tremendous way, I should say. But in my case, I almost feel like this trauma is almost like a river through my life, and has just like caused this huge gulf, like the Grand Canyon, that I have this, I had this life that was smooth and flat, and then this trauma came along, and it just has edged out this huge gully, like I don't even know how to call it, like chasm in my life, that I can, so much of my life has been impacted by the trauma. And I think it's because it was a very significant trauma, and because as much as the therapist tried to help me to develop positive coping skills as a result of what happened, when I was a kid, they didn't have a lot of the techniques that they have now. So they didn't have cognitive behavior therapy, which actually is what ended up helping me the most as an adult. Luckily, we do have really good techniques now. And so we can really help these kids if they, kids might develop anorexia as a result of this. Some kids might develop gender identity issues. Some kids might develop anorexia. And again, anorexia is connected to gender dysphoria, because when a girl starts developing, she tends to get curvier, and anorexic is going to feel really uncomfortable with that and can develop gender dysphoria. So these are all really interconnected, and need to be viewed as various ways of coping, rather than as evidence that somebody's born in the wrong body.
Yeah, and I want to make the point too that we all are born, and I think we have sort of tendencies certain ways, and we
Yeah.
sort of have natural tendencies in the way we cope with things. One person might just naturally be kind of a fighter, and the positive side of that is they're a leader, they're assertive, they take charge of situations, whereas another person is going to naturally be more of a people pleaser and considerate. And I think about my own three kids, they're all very different. My youngest is so emotionally savvy, and such as she just wants to make people happy and be kind and be supportive. But just knowing your child and recognizing kind of what has this child been like in the past,
Mm-hmm.
and what am I seeing happen now? And
Right.
what clues does that give me about kind of the time frame for when something may have happened? And how would you recommend, if a parent is seeing some changes in their child behaviorally, how would you recommend a parent address that with the child?
That's a really good question, because some change is really normal, especially during puberty. Kids are trying on different, almost different personas. That's normal and natural. And so you want to see that. But if a kid comes home and is suddenly, experiencing, saying things about, hating their body, hating themselves, or if you notice those dissociative behaviors, because um, dissociation, when I dissociated, it was pretty clear to my teachers I was zoning out. I mean, that was some of the, and a kid like that might be, called like a daydreamer, or, they might be, somebody might think maybe they have attention deficit disorder or something. But that zoning out is something to keep an eye on. If a kid who doesn't do that suddenly starts, if you see them just in a corner, just like completely, looking
Shut
like
down.
not present, that's really important. And I think talking to the child, I think um, just trying to eke it out and just maybe even saying, I've noticed some changes. Are you okay? Is there anything going on? I think kids develop these negative coping mechanisms because they don't know what else to do. And if there's a loving and compassionate adult in their life who can intervene, and I actually had a few, I would say, teachers were the ones who saved me. I had some amazing teachers who recognized that I was very troubled and just took some time to talk to me. I remember in 7th grade, I actually was suicidal, and I had a teacher who really, he just spent some time talking to me, and it helped so much. And part of it was the attention and the affirmation that I was getting, but part of it was having an adult who obviously was willing to spend time talking to me, and who cared about me, and was willing to just, it wasn't like he was a therapist or anything. He just recognized that I was very troubled and was willing to take the time to talk to me. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Well, I think you're just asking open-ended questions
Mm-hmm.
and making space.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so hard in our lives right now because we're so busy and we're so hyper scheduled. And unfortunately, you're probably not going to be able to schedule a deep heart talk with your child. It's going to have to happen when the child is ready.
Yeah.
But you can make those spaces available and ask open-ended questions, like the one that you suggested. Hey, I noticed something, it has changed. Can you tell me about this? That's a really unpressured question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about this?
Mm-hmm.
That invites a wider response from a child, and it's less, what's the word I'm looking for? Coercive. Like, tell me what happened today.
Right.
Tell me what
Right.
happened in school today.
Something's changed. What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, tell me more about how you're feeling. I'm curious why this change has happened. Just try to rehearse some of those open-ended questions and try to make space in your day, in your week, to have time alone with your child.
Yes, I
Even
think
if
that's
it's just
so
a car
critical.
ride.
Yeah, just to spend some time, maybe go for a walk, go for a hike, do something where you have some one-on-one time with your child so that they can tell you if something's going on. And one of the things that I feel really sad about is that, 5 years ago, I would have said, if your child did sustain a trauma, to get them into therapy, because they're going to need that kind of professional help. Now I'm more hesitant to say that because there are these bans on therapy, and if a child is coping with a transgender identity, then the therapist isn't going to help them. They actually could cause more harm. And so if you do identify that your child has had a trauma, be very cautious about how to proceed. Don't just immediately take them into therapy. Try to find a therapist who's not going to affirm them, who's going to, eke out those, whatever it is that happened, that's, try and help them process the trauma. And if you can't, if you live,
That sounds so wrong to say,
no,
find
I
a therapist
know.
who's not going to affirm them, but the language has been
Yeah.
co-opted. And
Yeah.
right now, affirmation means putting children on a path to medicalization.
Right. And that means denying them the kind of medical care, the kind of psychiatric care that they really need. And again, if your child is suicidal, then all bets are off. You need to get them help right away. But if it hasn't gotten to that point, be very cautious. Investigate. You may live in a state where the laws are very restrictive, and you might have to find a therapist online. And there are online therapists who are not restricted by state law, so you can circumvent it that way. You can also find a life coach who is this is somebody who's not licensed by the American Psychiatric Association, who is not under the same regulations as those who are licensed in the state. That can be an option. Finding a trusted friend. I mean, this is how people worked through problems before therapists were so ubiquitous. And so we know that there are, members of the community besides therapists who can help kids work through these issues. So maybe a trusted family member or a clergy member.
We can put in the resources under the video a helpful document about finding a gender critical therapist for your child, kind of how to go about that, the
Yeah.
questions to ask, and sort of how to vet somebody, because it is frightening how many therapists will automatically affirm this.
Right.
I told this story in an earlier video, but I think it's appropriate to tell it again, of one child who in the elementary school had been had an IEP, was in special ed, and so had a very close relationship with the school counselor in elementary school. In middle school, this child announced a transgender identity, and the parent thought, okay, I'm going to talk to the counselor from elementary school because that counselor really knows my child well. And the parent said that counselor had always been so helpful, not just with the child, but with the family. The parent said, sometimes she would go in and say, I've got this issue and I need a counselor. And the counselor was very good at listening, asking questions. What makes you feel this way? What about this? Just very good at what she did. Well, the parent called the elementary school counselor and told her, my daughter has just announced that she's transgender. And the first thing the counselor said was, you need to affirm that. You need to affirm.
Wow.
Very important that you affirm that so she doesn't commit suicide.
Oh,
No questions.
wow.
No, hey, did we ever see this?
This is
Because the
new,
child had
right?
never indicated, this
Right.
particular child had never indicated any
Right.
discomfort with her sex
Right.
before.
Wow.
That is a huge red flag. That's a change in behavior to say, wait, something's wrong here, because that counselor never responded to an issue
Wow.
with a blanket statement before about anything.
Yeah. And that's just, it's so upsetting to me because, one of the things that I wanted when I was, presenting as trans, when I was insisting that I was a boy, is I wanted access to the boys' restroom. That was, I wanted to go to the bathroom with the boys. And I think about it now, and I think about, this confluence of, you've got a kid who's been traumatized, who dissociates, who's insisting she's a boy, and then putting her in a boys' or men's bathroom is, to me, such a dangerous situation, because here's a child who is really at risk for being re-victimized, and predators can sense it. Predators have like this radar. They can tell what kid is going to be a good victim, basically, who's going to be vulnerable. They can tell by body language. They have this figured out. They're good at what they do. And so you take a girl who's struggling with herself, who's having issues, and then put her in a situation where she's much more vulnerable. It just is such a huge disservice. And for that school counselor not to have, even questioned, this is new behavior, something's going on, we should probably figure out, what changed, what's happening here. Because we know that that children are not born in the wrong body. And it's also ironic to me, because this is where the gender industry kind of gets twisted in circles, as they say, you're born in the wrong body, you've always been that way. And yet so many of these kids are developing a trans identity. They're not, it's not like they had it their whole lives. They're developing it, which means that whole idea that you're born that way isn't correct. And then we have kids who are gender fluid, which means you can go back and forth, apparently. But then they say if somebody detransitions, they weren't really transgender. I mean, it's this whole like somersault. And that's something that they've said to me, and that they've said to detransitioners and desisters over and over again. Well, if you were really trans, you wouldn't have desisted, you wouldn't have detransitioned. Therefore, you really don't know what it's like to be transgender. And to me, that is, again, such a dangerous message. It's this message that it's invalidating all these experiences, of girls. I didn't go on hormones. I didn't go on puberty blockers. I didn't get my breast removed because that wasn't an option. I'm sure I would have. And many of these young women have. And then they're being told, well, you were never really transgender, which maybe is the point, because nobody really is transgender. I mean,
Well, that's a very good point.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and that is ultimately the point. There are kids, and we know that, I think it's 0.02% of the population, it's very tiny, historically, who have been wanting to cross-dress, who have, been what we would call transsexual. And that's sort of accepted. And most of those are gay men or autogynephilic men. That's sort of been the demographic, and that has just been turned upside down. Now the big pharma companies realize they can make a ton of money on this, and big, surgeons, all the, this medical industrial complex has just determined that this is, and there's so much money to be made, that all of a sudden we're just having this, explosion. And anytime there's an epidemic of something, historically, we look at that very critically. And yet in this case, rather than saying, wow, we're having all these kids becoming medicalized, we're celebrating it. Something's off there.
And going back to trauma, we're not dealing with the trauma. We're not helping kids with the trauma that they've gone through. And preliminary studies are showing that most of these kids who are coming out as transgender have some comorbid issue. either autism, like we talked about last time, or trauma, past trauma in their lives. They've already got OCD, self-cutting,
Mhm.
depression, and we'll talk about depression next time. Why are we not looking at that?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's because somebody doesn't want us to.
No. So we
Okay.
have a video by Hank Green. It's a crash course on trauma and addiction. We're just going to watch a very short clip of it to sort of reinforce some of the things we've talked about.
It could be September 11th, or a serious car accident, or a natural disaster, or a violent crime that you survived but are still haunted by. Trauma comes in many different forms, and sometimes it can stick with you. When it manifests as nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance, fear, guilt, anxiety, rage, insomnia, and begins to interfere with your ability to function, it can come to be known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It was once called shell shock, a term used to describe the condition of veterans like Tolkien in World War I, but PTSD isn't limited to veterans. It's defined as a psychological disorder generated by witnessing or experiencing a traumatic event. Its symptoms are classified into 4 major clusters in the DSM-5. One of these clusters involves reliving the event through intrusive memories, nightmares, or flashbacks. The second involves avoiding situations you associate with the event, while the third generally describes excessive physiological arousal, like heart-pounding, muscle tension, anxiety, or irritability, and major problems sleeping or concentrating. Finally, we have the 4th major symptom cluster, pervasive negative changes in emotions and belief, like feelings of excessive guilt, fear, or shame, or no longer getting enjoyment out of what you used to. PTSD patients also experience numbing, or periods of feeling emotionless or emotionally flat, and dissociation, feeling as if situations aren't real or are surreal, feeling like time is slowed down or sped up, or even blacking out. We've been discussing how anxiety and mood disorders can affect a person's ability to function, and how that impairment itself leads to more suffering and dysfunction. When any of these disorders is left untreated, sufferers may start to feel desperate to find some way to cope. How do you identify and diagnose these disorders, and how do you treat them so that the patients can recover, with the understanding that they might never be the same as they were before the trauma, but they can still be healthy and happy? In a way, psychology helps patients ask themselves what Tolkien asks his readers, and what Frodo asks when he's finally safe back in the Shire. How do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand that there is no going back?
Well, Maria, that was really a good explanation of trauma. And I think it's important for people to explore it more. Again, we're not experts on this. I can share my own experience and you can share what you've learned, but we're not the experts. And I would encourage people to go out and find other resources if they have questions about this. We have another short clip that we were going to tell, and I'm going to let you introduce it.
Yeah, because I know you said when you saw it, you weren't sure what was happening there because you hadn't seen the movie.
Right.
This is from Inside Out. It's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, it's like a 90-minute AP psychology course on trauma. And this little girl, Riley, has experienced a huge trauma. Her family has moved across the country. She's lost her friends. She's lost her home. She had an embarrassing first day at school. I mean, just everything that can go wrong goes wrong. And what we're going to see is what's going on inside her head. The main character is Bing Bong. He was her imaginary playmate when she was small. And Bing Bong is in her memory. And these 2 emotional parts of her, happy, joy and sadness, are there interacting with Bing Bong. And Bing Bong is upset because he realizes he's being forgotten. Riley is forgetting about her childhood and he's being forgotten and he's grieving. Joy is trying to make him happy. Like, if we're just all happy, everything will be great.
Okay.
And Joy is trying to prevent sadness from interacting with Bing Bong.
Oh, interesting.
But watch what happens.
Okay.
Hey, who's ticklish, huh? Here comes the tickle monster. Hey, Bing Bong, look at this.
We can get over feeling sad quite rapidly once we are allowed to gain a resolution to our pain. Never try to hide your feelings when they surface. They are essential to our well-being to be experienced.
You took something that you loved. It's gone. Forever.
Sadness. Don't make him feel worse.
Sorry.
It's all I had left of Riley.
I bet you and Riley had great adventures.
Oh, they were wonderful. Once we flew back in time. We had breakfast twice that day.
Sadness!
It sounds amazing. I bet Riley liked it.
Oh, she did. We were best friends.
Yeah, it's sad.
I'm okay now. Come on. The train station is this way.
So, Maria, after you explained this, it made a lot more sense to me, because one of the things that happens that I think parents lovingly have a tendency to do is to try and make things better. It's hard to see your kid hurting. It's hard to see them struggling. And I think often we play that role of wanting to be like, it's okay, everything's all right. Hey, let's go over here and do something fun, or let's pretend like everything's okay, because we sort of, it's hard as a parent to see your child struggle. And yet, if we do that, it can really cause problems. First of all, it can make them feel like they can't talk to us because they don't want to come, they don't want to disappoint us. They don't want to make us feel bad. And they pick it up. If they know that, if they know that their emotions are too strong for you to handle as a parent, they're not going to open up to you. And so it's really important to give your child space to feel those strong, heavy emotions.
Well, and especially if you have a sensitive child, like I mentioned, my youngest daughter is very emotionally sensitive. And she has told me that there were times she didn't want to tell me what was bothering her, what was hurting her, because she didn't want to upset me. She didn't want to make me sad. Oh, that's not her role. Her role as a child is not to protect my emotions. My role as a parent is to help her cope with hers. And so, yeah, just offering your child that place to just listening, empathetically listening can be so therapeutic. Just like in the video, that's all Bing Bong needed, was just to express, I'm sad. This is why I'm sad. Let me cry on your shoulder. One thing I think we heard at our age growing up is crying doesn't fix anything. I heard that all the time.
Buck up,
Well,
it's not that bad.
scientists have
I'll give you
now
something to cry about.
right. Scientists have now discovered that there are stress hormones in tears. When you cry, your tears actually do release stress hormones.
Wow.
And so crying does do good. It does help. And we need to provide that opportunity for our kids to process and grieve and cry and deal with what's happened.
Yeah, and one of the things that the transgender ideology does is encourages kids to stuff their feelings, and to run away from their feelings. And so if your child doesn't feel like their feelings are okay, or that they're able to talk about their feelings, that could make them more vulnerable to this ideology. And so it really is important to be able to allow your child to express sometimes really unpleasant feelings. And it is hard as a parent. I hate seeing my kids suffer. But at the same time, I would so much rather have them cry on my shoulder than stuff it down and pretend like everything's okay, or to, develop a transgender identity, or to go up in their room and cut themselves. I mean, and that's, again, that's not to say if your child develops a transgender identity or cuts themselves that it's because you're not a caring and loving parent, or that you're not doing it right. This is all, like, all we can do is the best that we can do. And sometimes, even if a parent is doing everything right, the child might develop this transgender identity, this child might cut. So again, there's so much pressure on parents. And I feel like historically mothers have been blamed for their children. It used to be mothers were blamed if a child was autistic or developmentally delayed, that there was something wrong with her parenting. And I don't want parents to feel that, because, we live in a very complex world. There are so many variables and so many factors playing into what's happening with your child.
And none of us are perfect parents.
No.
The best parent on the planet is not a perfect parent. And so it is. Sometimes these things are just going to come into your family, and you've got to deal with them as best you can. I want to echo what you said, Erin, that don't take this as it's your fault, I did something wrong. You may have, you may not have. The important thing is to figure out how to help your child to be healthy again.
Yeah. And we do have a couple questions from a parent. I'm going to ask the first one. It says, how do I know if trauma is responsible for my child's gender dysphoria? That is a really good question. And it's probably not something you'll ever know 100%. But if your child has had trauma and then develops gender dysphoria, you can feel pretty confident there's a connection there. It's not necessarily causal, and we talked about that in another video, that one thing didn't necessarily directly cause it, but that there's somehow it is a huge influencing factor. Like you said, kids are, I'm convinced that kids are sort of pre-programmed with tendencies to react certain ways. So some kids might, develop OCD. Some kids might develop, personality disorder. Some kids might dissociate. Some kids might, turn into that kid who just stuffs everything down and pretends everything's okay, and then, explodes when they're 20. They're all different ways in which kids respond to things. But if there is a trauma and then shortly thereafter a child develops gender dysphoria, I think there's a pretty good chance that trauma was what tipped that child into the trans identity.
Yeah. And again, the important thing to look for is changes. Sudden and big changes in your child's behavior, your child's sleeping, eating, socializing patterns. A sudden change of friend group is a big tip off. Now, young kids will change friends pretty frequently, but by the time they're kind of in junior high, they're sort of solidifying that friend group. And to suddenly drop all of one set of friends and have another set of friends, that can be a big red flag. So looking for changes, just comparing, how was this child 6 months ago and how are they now? That'll give you some clues if something's going on.
And it's so fascinating to me as we're talking, because I'm thinking about the lens with which my teachers viewed me as a child versus the lens that teachers view children through now. The lens my teachers viewed me through was, something's up. Like, there's something seriously wrong with Erin. She's changed. We need to get her help. We need to figure out what's going on because her behavior is not functional. Nowadays, if, in the same circumstances, I'm afraid that the same teacher might say, well, the reason that Erin's become so aggressive is because she's not being affirmed. And so it's this lens. And unfortunately, teachers now aren't our necessarily going to be our partners in this. It used to be that teachers might alert a parent if there was a sudden shift in behavior that was concerning. Now they might hide it from parents. So again, it's a lot harder than it used to be, I think, for parents to figure out what's going on with their child.
Yeah, it really is. That's a good point. Most of the people out in the culture are not on your side. And that's unconscionable is the word that I just keep using over and over again. But there's this misguided savior complex wrapped around this ideology, this one particular thing. If a child expresses an alternate gender identity, that is the golden ticket to, we need to cut off those toxic parents who don't agree. And it's really disconcerting. It's really concerning.
Oh gosh,
and
especially if you have a child with trauma, cutting them off from parents and family. I mean, just talk
that's
about
the last thing you want to do is cut them off from their best sense sources of support.
I mean, that just it's so, it is overwhelming, and thankfully there are resources out there. So the next question is, how do I find appropriate care for my child if I think the problem is unresolved trauma and not gender identity? And we
Yeah,
did
we
touch
covered that
upon
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you
look
have
at
any
that
other
resource.
ideas?
just look at that resource that we're going to put in the information below the video, how to find a gender critical or trustworthy therapist for your child. That gives some good guidelines. One of the things I tell people, whether you're a person of faith or not, sometimes a church, a mosque, a synagogue is a good place to start, even if you're not, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, because at least we still have religious freedom as the law of the land in America. That's being assaulted. And I know that the activists in this arena are trying to prevent, are trying to thwart religious freedom, but we still have it. And so counselors, pastors, rabbis are still able to counsel people according to their holy texts. And we know that most major religions do not consider transgenderism a possible way that human beings have been created.
Right.
So that might be a good, safe place to start.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Call the church or synagogue or mosque, the desk, just whoever's answering the phones, and just say, I'd like to talk to someone about counseling, and ask, what is your organization's position on transgender ideology, and see what they say.
Yeah, and find out, because I know that I have we actually have a mutual friend who's in the Jewish community, and she said that the more I guess modern Jewish communities, not the Orthodox, but I'm not even sure what the term is, the more progressive Jewish communities have accepted transgenderism. And I know that I interviewed a young woman who is Jewish, and actually I believe a fairly Orthodox Jew, and even in that community, they were willing to accommodate her trans identity. And I've heard that some Christian communities now are sort of saying, you know what, we're going to go ahead and accept this. And I think it's because they don't want to be viewed as intolerant. And it's such a huge disservice. It makes me really sad. Another
But
thing,
it's important to make sure that
because there are communities, religious communities that will 100% affirm a child, but there's also communities out there that will help you. So try and find those. The other thing I want to do is put a plug in for our new Facebook group. And one thing that can really be helpful for parents is to have a support system. And so we have a Facebook group to go along with Common Sense Care. And we welcome you to join. We'll put a link down below. And this is just a way for us, first of all, to find out what questions do you have as parents? What can we help you with? But to also find support from other parents and interested people, those who are concerned about this ideology.
We are not doctors or therapists. We are not giving medical or psychiatric advice, and we offer no guarantee of outcomes. We simply want to talk about how to support and love kids using long understood best practices from the fields of psychology, education, and child development. We're glad you joined in our conversation today, and we hope that you took away something you can put in your toolkit for parenting your gender-confused kids with truth and love.